So we got the frame done, we got all the tape on, we got the stair boxes wrapped around, and now we're ready to start putting the deck boards on the top with the border board around the perimeter. So we're going to start installing the boards against the house. We're going to use a groove board because the outside edge of the groove will be up against the house, so we won't notice that. And that sets us up perfectly to use the hideaway hidden fasteners. And we'll use those on all our field boards. Along the inside edge, we're going to use the deck plugs and the screws. So we already set up our starter boards, one against the house over here and one against the house there. We already checked to make sure the house is nice and straight, so we can use spacer blocks to space the deck boards off the wall by about 1/4, 3/16. That way, again, water that's flowing down the wall and any leaves or other debris that fall on the deck will be able to drop right through and down to the ground without causing a water capture point or a debris capture point. We've already mitered the inside corner here, and we're spacing the miters at 1/8 of an inch. So I've got a spacer which is a little less than 1/8, so when we bring those boards together, we'll have a 1/8 inch space, which is what's required by Trex for all of their joints when we're above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. If we were below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, we would increase that to about 1/4 of an inch. So we'll be using the Trex fascia board as our riser board. I want to space those off of the deck frame in order to allow water to flow through. If we put the fascia board in direct contact with the framing, water that gets in there is going to tend to soak into the wood. The drier we can keep the wood, the better it's going to last. So by spacing it, it's kind of like creating a rain screen. The water is going to flow through. I've already ripped a bunch of spacer boards at about 5/16 of an inch. When we add that to the thickness of the riser board, that's going to end up projecting out our treads just the right distance so that 2 deck treads will end up with about a 3/4 of an inch overhang, which was what we're targeting. So I want to target that same distance up here, overhanging the front of the deck, so both the stair tread overhangs and the overhang on the top of the deck are all one and the same. So I can take this, put it in position instead of just doing a measurement, run this over and make a mark with a pencil, and then transfer that mark, and then I can add in for my overhang. So right now what I had penciled in earlier isn't correct, so I can erase that, and then I can draw my new miter mark, cut it on the chop saw, bring it back, and then we know we're right in the right spot. Looks good, let's screw it down. So these screws are the ones intended for the Trex hideaway plug system. I've already marked out 1.5 inches in, which puts me in the center of that rim board that goes around the perimeter. And this is the driver bit. You'll notice as I drive it in that this little rubber cap piece will squish down and then will disengage from the teeth of the spline of the screw head. So you keep driving until you hear that little thud, and that's where the spline disengages from the screw. And then we'll come back later and put the plugs in when we wrap up the whole deck. I have not mitered the outside corner here, so I'm just going to drive 2 screws about 3/4 of the way in so I can back them out. But in the meantime, it'll hold this end board in place so that we can start installing the field boards. Then once they're done, I can take those screws out, cut my miter, set it in, and that way the front border board miter will look perfect. I want to make sure that the length of all of my deck boards, which go in the field of the decking between the border boards, are cut to the right length. I don't want to cut them in place. I could do that, but because we got the joist tape on top, if I run my saw blade long on a track saw and it cuts down into that tape, then I've defeated the purpose of having the tape. So instead what we're doing is we already have that inside corner established between the inside border board and the end board. And now I've set up just a temporary piece here at the outside edge, and I put my spacer in for my 1/8 inch space. And now Addison's going to take the tape measure, put the spacer that he has there up against the inside border board, and I'm going to measure to the outside border board. These spacers are already going to establish our 1/8 inch space. So all I got to do is read right off the tape measure. So we need 102 3/4. So we're going to cut 102 3/4 for all of our deck boards. That way when we drop them in, they'll be spaced just as they're supposed to be. So Trex has a universal installation tool which works with their hideaway fastener. It's got a molded tip so it matches the profile of the clip. So you just lock it in, and then you've got a hole so that you don't have to precisely position the screw bit in the head of the screw itself. That little inverted cone positions the driver bit right where it belongs. And when you drive the screw in, it won't let you overdrive the fastener too far. So when I disengage it, now it's raised up just enough so that when I bring the next board in, it'll engage. So let's install all of these, and we'll just walk our way right down the whole row, and then we'll push the next board in, and we'll do the next row, and the next row. One thing I should mention now, let's pull this back a second. One thing that can happen, because we're just using the hidden fasteners that are trapping the board in the groove, there's no physical fasteners going through the board to hold it down to the deck frame. So what can happen over time with expansion and contractions over several seasons or over several years is that the board can actually walk one way or the other. And the intentional gaps that we're going to be leaving on the left and the right will end up crowding to one side or the other. So I'm going to take one of these screws out of the hidden fastener, and I'm going to trap the board down by driving a diagonal screw roughly in the middle of the board down into a joist. And I'm just going to angle it so that it's not going to interfere with the next board coming in. And now that'll stop that board from walking. Okay, now we can screw in the next board. Sometimes with the way the boards are stored, they can take on a little bit of a curve. This one's got a little bit of a curve, and we want to take that out. We could use a board straightening tool, but I don't have any with me. So instead I'm going to use an old trick, which is kick the board in, take a screw. This is going to serve two purposes. That purpose I showed earlier of locking the board in, and it's also going to help draw the board into the previous one, so we close that gap up a little. Now I check it. Yep, that's good and straight. So now we can finish putting in the board. This is a square edge board. It doesn't have the groove in it like all of the others we used here. And we're using it so that it has a nice finished look on the outside edge for our border. This is the end joist, so this is the end border board, and then we'll have one analogous there on the front. What I'm going to do right now is space my gap here, space my gap along the edge here to the boards, just as Addison did on that side. And that way we can get a distance from that end to this end for our outside border board. Then I'm going to determine the overhang here so that when I make my miter, I've got it in the right spot to match the front border board. So it's going to be a few steps that I'm going to work through over the next few minutes. And I got 113 3/4. So I could take a measurement, cut it, and go with it, which would work fine, but sometimes I get fussy. And I just want to make sure that I've got the right balance on the left and the right side. I'm also micro adjusting and checking my distance away from the wood framing underneath, because that's going to gauge the spacer that I use behind the riser board. So I'm just doing a double, triple, quadruple check, because what I don't want to have happen, I'd be stuck if I made a miscalculation and cut it incorrectly. So this is looking right about where it's supposed to be. I'm going to make a mark. I should use a shim just so it looks clear. I'm going to make this mark right here, which is that space that I want between the two boards. So now I've got that set to cut, And I'll do the same at the other side. And this is the one that we just tack screwed, so I'll be able to remove this board to make that final cut. You know, I can put this down out of the way. This board is loose. Addison can unscrew that one and bring it over to me, and then I'll make the cuts. Notice, no slot. Noticed, hidden fastener intended for a groove board. We got a problem. Well, not a problem. We knew this, so we have a tool to fix it. I'm marking where the slots are going to go, and I'm going to use a router with the Trex grooving tool to make grooves just where the fasteners are located. You could do the entire board, but that's excess work that you don't need to do. So we're just going to do little slots where we need them. I'm going to be using a regular router. It could be any size, a little laminate router. It could be a big plunge router. But the important thing I've got here is the Trex grooving tool. It has the same profile to create the same groove that the slotted boards have. It's got a top bearing to space it just the right depth. So all I have to do is drop it in position in front of the slots that I made earlier to locate the hidden fasteners. I'm going to bump it in, draw it down, release it, bring it down to the next spot, and go all the way down the board in one pass. Yep, looks good. So I'm going to mark the location for all the screws in line with the center of the joists at 2.5 inches in, which is right in the center of the rim board. Addison, if you want to follow behind me, you can start those screws. So our last deck board is nice and straight, but you might be able to notice that our border board, the one without the grooves, got a little bow to it. So we're going to move that in. I'm going to do it with a combination of a mallet strike and a leverage board. There.